The Garden of Eden isn't just a story about the first humans. It's a story about what you're not allowed to question. Because, to believe it fully, you have to ignore things your mind naturally notices. You have to ignore curiosity, ignore consent, ignore responsibility. And most of all, you have to ignore how humans actually learn. This isn't a story about innocence lost. It's a story about obedience demanded. And once you see what the story quietly asks you to overlook, it never feels the same again. The forbidden tree problem. Let's start with the tree, because everything begins here. Not just any tree, not a random plant in a mythical garden, but the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Even the name is loaded. It is not the tree of fire or the tree of violence. It is the tree of moral awareness. The tree is framed as dangerous precisely because it opens the mind. Now, think about the setup. God creates humans without knowledge of good and evil, then places the most morally significant object in their world right in the center of their world, then gives them a command that only makes full sense if you already understand morality. Do not eat. Do not cross this line. Trust me. But what does trust even mean to a mind that has not yet learned what betrayal is? What does obedience mean to a mind that cannot fully grasp wrongness? Here is the contradiction the story quietly asks you to step over. Adam and Eve are treated like accountable adults, yet they are built like moral children. If you do not know what good is, you cannot recognize the goodness of obeying. If you do not know what evil is, you cannot understand the weight of disobeying. Which means the act is judged with a standard that did not exist inside them yet. And when they finally eat, what happens? Their eyes open. That is the phrase. Awareness arrives, shame arrives, self-consciousness arrives, moral language becomes possible. It is only after the bite that the categories of right and wrong become real in their minds. So the knowledge required to truly comprehend the rule comes after the rule is broken. That is why the punishment feels less like justice and more like a trap disguised as a test. It is punishment after the lesson, consequences after the understanding, blame after the awakening. In any human context, we would call that unfair. We would call it entrapment, yet the story demands you call it holy. And to accept it cleanly, you have to ignore one simple question that keeps trying to surface. How can someone be guilty for not understanding guilt yet? The story does not pause to answer because pausing changes everything. Once you stop and hold that question in your hands, the logic starts cracking, and the garden stops looking like paradise and starts looking like a controlled environment. The illusion of free will. We are told, almost casually, that Adam and Eve had free will. It is presented as obvious, as settled fact. They chose, they disobeyed. Therefore, they are responsible. But that claim only works if you never stop to examine what freedom actually requires. Because freedom without information is not freedom at all. It is guesswork wrapped in responsibility. Picture the situation honestly. Two beings with no lived experience of deception, harm, or consequence are placed into a world already governed by invisible rules. They are given a single command, do not eat, with no explanation that makes moral sense to a mind that does not yet understand morality. No reason, no context, just authority. And when curiosity does what curiosity always does, punishment follows. Now imagine this same setup in any human setting. A parent tells a child, do not touch that, and refuses to explain why. The child touches it anyway, not out of malice, but out of curiosity and confusion. Then the parent responds with severe punishment and lifelong consequences. We would not call that a fair test of freedom. We would call it conditioning through fear. Yet the story of Eden asks you to call this free will. Because real choice requires understanding. You cannot meaningfully choose obedience if you do not understand what obedience protects. You cannot meaningfully reject a rule if you do not know why the rule exists. Choice without clarity is not freedom. It is a setup where only one outcome is acceptable and the other exists merely to justify punishment. And here is where the story quietly turns. The very moment Adam and Eve demonstrate independent thinking, the very moment they step outside blind trust, that act is labeled the original sin, not violence, not cruelty. Thinking, awareness, the ability to evaluate rather than simply comply. Which leads to the uncomfortable question the story never answers directly. Was the real problem disobedience, or was it independence? Was it breaking a rule or breaking reliance? Because the act that proves they can reason for themselves is treated as the ultimate failure. Once that idea enters your mind, the story shifts tone. Free will starts to look more like permitted choice within strict boundaries. Freedom starts to resemble obedience with consequences. And Eden stops being a test of human morality and starts to look like a warning about what happens when trust turns into thinking. From that point on, the story feels different, because you are no longer looking at a fall, you are looking at a boundary being crossed. The snake wasn't wrong. We are taught from the beginning who the villain is supposed to be: the serpent, the deceiver, the liar, the embodiment of evil. But if you slow down and actually listen to what the snake says, something uncomfortable happens. The words do not match the reputation. The snake makes two clear claims: you will not surely die, your eyes will be opened. That is it. No riddles, no hidden meanings, just a prediction of consequences. And when the story unfolds, both claims come true. Adam and Eve do not collapse on the spot. They do not vanish into dust. They live. What changes is their awareness. They see themselves differently. They recognize shame. They understand vulnerability. Their eyes are opened exactly as promised. That alone should make you pause. Because deception is usually measured by outcomes. A lie produces false expectations. But here, the outcome matches the warning. The snake does not misrepresent reality. He describes it. Which raises an unsettling question. If the serpent was lying, where is the lie? Now compare that with the warning they were given before. Eat the fruit and you will die. That is the threat. Yet what arrives is not death but knowledge. Consciousness expands. Moral awareness begins. Life becomes complicated, painful, and finite, yes, but not immediately ended. The consequence is transformation, not execution. So to preserve the moral structure of the story, something has to be ignored. Accuracy. The snake must be evil, not because he was wrong, but because he spoke truth without permission. And that distinction matters more than it seems. Because it quietly teaches that truth itself is not the highest value. Authority is. Once truth is judged by its source instead of its content, understanding becomes secondary. The question is no longer is this true, but who said it? And once that shift happens, thinking becomes dangerous. Curiosity becomes suspect. Accuracy becomes irrelevant if it challenges hierarchy. This is a powerful lesson to embed in a foundational story. It trains the listener to distrust insight that does not come from the approved voice, even if it matches reality, even if it aligns with experience, even if it turns out to be right. And that is where the danger lies. Because when truth is treated as evil simply because it came from the wrong mouth, authority no longer needs to explain itself. It only needs to be obeyed. Understanding becomes optional. Trust becomes mandatory. Once you accept that logic, the serpent no longer looks like the central threat. The threat becomes independent verification, and at that point, the story stops being about deception and starts being about control. Why knowledge is the real crime. Ask yourself a simple question and sit with it for a moment. Why is knowledge the forbidden thing? Not violence, not cruelty, not domination, not harm. Understanding, awareness. The ability to tell right from wrong, that is the line that cannot be crossed. The moment humans gain awareness, they are expelled. Not after they hurt someone, not after they destroy the garden, not after they become cruel. Immediately after they understand, pain begins. Labor becomes suffering. Survival becomes struggle. Life itself turns into a sentence. The crime is not what they do, it is what they now know. That detail matters more than the story wants you to notice. Because the message it sends is quiet but powerful. Ignorance is safety. Awareness is danger. As long as you do not know, you are protected. The moment you see clearly, you are no longer welcome. Paradise is reserved for those who do not ask too many questions. And to accept this story as moral truth, you have to ignore something fundamental about being human. Every meaningful human advance has come from the exact thing Eden condemns. Science did not come from obedience. Medicine did not come from silence. Ethics did not come from blind trust. Progress did not come from staying in the garden. Everything that reduced suffering came from questioning what already was. From looking at the world and saying, this does not have to be this way. from refusing to accept mystery as an excuse, from choosing understanding over comfort. Yet in Eden, that instinct is framed as rebellion. The story teaches that awareness leads to pain, but it leaves out something crucial. Awareness also leads to responsibility, to empathy, to the ability to reduce harm. Pain does not enter the world because humans know more. Pain becomes visible because humans can finally recognize it. A child does not suffer less because they do not understand suffering. They simply cannot name it yet. Awareness does not create pain, it reveals it, which changes how the punishment looks. It stops being a response to evil behavior and starts looking like a consequence assigned to consciousness itself, as if the price of understanding must always be suffering, as if safety requires ignorance. And that is why this chapter of the story should make you pause. Because it quietly frames thinking as the danger, curiosity as the risk, and understanding as the fall. Eden is not really a warning about evil. It is a warning about thinking too much. Once you see that, the story no longer feels like ancient wisdom. It feels like a rule meant to survive questioning, the absence of consent. Here is something almost never addressed when this story is told. Adam and Eve never consented to the rules. They were not asked if they agreed to the conditions. They were not given a choice about the system they were placed into. They simply came into existence inside a structure that was already complete, already governed, already armed with consequences. No contract, no negotiation, no informed agreement. They were not told the consequences clearly, not in a way that a mind without moral understanding could fully grasp. Death was mentioned, but not explained. Suffering was not described. Exile was not outlined. There was no moment where the full weight of the choice was placed in front of them with clarity and understanding. There were no alternatives offered, no option to leave, no option to refuse participation. The only real option was compliance. They were created into a system and then blamed for reacting within it. And what makes this even more unsettling is that the punishment does not stop with them, it spills outward. Every human inherits the fallout. Pain in childbirth is not chosen by newborns. Struggle for survival is not agreed to by future generations. Death itself becomes a universal sentence passed down to those who never stood in the garden and never touched the tree. To accept this as justice, you have to ignore personal responsibility entirely, because accountability, as we understand it, does not transfer across generations. No court on earth would punish children for the actions of distant ancestors. No ethical framework would call inherited suffering fair or reasonable. Yet the story asks you to accept it anyway. Not just to accept it, but to call it righteous. And notice what is being trained here. Fairness is not the standard. Consent is not the standard. Understanding is not the standard. Authority is. Because once you begin questioning fairness, the structure starts to shake. Facts can be debated, interpretations can be argued, but fairness cuts deeper. It forces you to ask whether power itself is justified, whether rules are moral simply because they exist. That is why this part of the story is so often passed over quickly, because questioning fairness is more dangerous than questioning facts. Facts can be reframed, fairness cannot. Once you see the absence of consent, the story no longer feels like a moral lesson. It starts to feel like a system that demands acceptance without agreement. And that realization changes how you hear everything that follows. The story's real function. So why does this story endure for thousands of years? Not just survive, but embed itself so deeply into culture, morality, and identity. Because it does not merely explain something that happened long ago. It trains something that happens again and again. It programs the future. The Garden of Eden is not only a story about origins, it is a template. It teaches, quietly and early, that authority comes before understanding, that obedience is safer than curiosity. That questioning is not neutral but dangerous. Step too far outside the boundary, and exile follows. Control is never presented as control. It is framed as care, protection, love. The rule exists for your own good. The consequence is your fault. And once that framing settles in, something remarkable happens. You no longer need guards at the gates of Eden. You no longer need constant enforcement. People begin to police themselves. They learn to suppress doubt before it becomes a question. to feel guilt for curiosity before curiosity turns into action, to distrust their own minds when thoughts move beyond approved limits. The boundary becomes internal. The exile becomes psychological. And that is the real power of the story. Because when a belief system reaches that point, it no longer relies on force. It relies on fear of thinking wrong, fear of stepping too far, fear of becoming the kind of person who asks forbidden questions. But here is the unsettling part. This pattern does not end with religion. It appears wherever power fears independent thought, in politics, in ideology, in institutions that survive by discouraging examination rather than earning trust. The symbols change, but the structure stays the same. There is always a garden. There is always a rule that cannot be questioned. There is always a punishment framed as consequence rather than choice. And there is always a warning that curiosity leads to loss. That is why the Eden story feels timeless. Not because it speaks eternal truth, but because it maps perfectly onto how authority protects itself. It understands human psychology, it understands fear, it understands how to turn obedience into virtue and doubt into danger. Once you see that function, the story stops being a myth about the past. It becomes a mirror held up to the present, and that is when it becomes impossible to unsee what Eden says about us. Strip away the symbolism and the theology, and Eden stops feeling divine and starts feeling painfully human. At its core, it is not a story about gods and gardens. It is a story about growing up, about crossing a threshold you can never uncross, about leaving innocence behind and realizing the world is more complicated than you were prepared for. Every human life follows this arc. There is a moment when the world stops being simple, when authority figures are no longer automatically right, when you realize that safety often came from not knowing, that comfort was tied to limits you did not choose, and that awareness carries a cost. Eden captures that moment perfectly. The eyes open, the innocence fades, shame appears, responsibility enters the picture, the world becomes heavier. But instead of honoring that transition as growth, the story frames it as a fall, as a mistake, as if maturity itself is a failure. That framing matters more than it seems. Because once awareness is labeled as disobedience, growing up becomes something to apologize for, questioning becomes something to fear, insight becomes something that needs forgiveness. The story quietly teaches that staying childlike is virtuous and stepping beyond is dangerous. And to believe that, you have to ignore your own life. Every moment of real growth you have ever had came from stepping outside a comfortable garden. Every hard truth you learned came with discomfort. Every deeper understanding cost you certainty. You did not gain wisdom by staying sheltered. You gained it by confronting things you once did not want to see. You were not punished for understanding more. You were changed by it. The pain did not come because awareness was wrong. It came because reality is complex. Because knowing more means feeling more. Because empathy expands alongside understanding. The loss of innocence hurts, but it is not a moral failure. It is a human one. Necessary. Irreversible. Eden reframes that universal experience as wrongdoing. It takes a natural developmental step and calls it sin. And once that idea takes hold, people begin to associate growth with guilt, awareness with danger, independence with loss. But look closely at your own story. You did not fall when you learned the truth about the world. You did not fall when you questioned what you were taught. You did not fall when certainty gave way to complexity. You woke up. And that realization changes everything. Because if Eden is a metaphor for awakening, then exile is not punishment. It is simply what happens when innocence ends. You cannot return to the garden, not because you are broken, but because you are aware. And once you see Eden that way, the story stops being about what we lost and starts being about what we became. The Garden of Eden doesn't collapse under scrutiny because it's ancient. It collapses because it asks you to abandon the very tools that make you human. Curiosity, reason, moral intuition. It isn't the story of humanity's downfall. It's the story of authority fearing independence. And once you see that, the exile makes sense, because a thinking mind was never meant to stay in Eden. So the real question isn't why they ate the fruit. It's why we're still being told that thinking was the mistake. If this made you question what you were taught, stay curious. And if you value truth over comfort, subscribe. because the real forbidden knowledge has always been the courage to ask,